Hi, I'm Dr. Tim Shu. I'm the founder and CEO of VetCBD, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
Welcome, listeners. And today we've got a man whose face won't do. It's Tim Shu. No. I'm obviously joking. He's a very handsome man. And if you come to the UK, to the Global Cannabis Institute's conference in November, you'll be able to see him talk for yourself. Johnny, what was it like talking with Tim?
Tim's a great guy. We were chatting about VetCBD, the company that he's the CEO of, and I found it particularly interesting. I know the two of us have actually had quite a few conversations with folks that are working in the veterinary CBD market, but none so far that have used THC in their product.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I remember CBD for horses, but I've actually heard rumours that THC, especially for canines, can be quite discombobulating, to say the least.
Well, supposedly not, according to Tim, but rather than hearing it from us, let's hear from the man himself.
Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Tim Shu, founder and CEO of VetCBD, a privately held company specialising in cannabis-based products for pets. Having cut his teeth as a vet, often helping to provide treatment to pets from low-income backgrounds, Tim has been able to put his experience and expertise behind driving forward VetCBD and educating those in the pet care space. Sound about right to you, Tim?
That's correct. Thank you for having me on the show, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
So, Tim, one of the questions that we ask to all of our guests on Professionally Cannabis is, what led you to the plant?
Well, as a healthcare practitioner, I've always had a duty to be able to research and provide therapeutic benefits for patients. And, I was already familiar with the plant for human uses and saw the medical benefits of it. And as a veterinarian, my goal has always been that if cannabis can offer therapeutic benefits for animals, then we really need to be able to explore that and offer that as an option for our patients.
And so on that, cannabis-based pet care, tell us more.
So cannabis has a number of therapeutic benefits. A lot of people are familiar with its uses in humans, but because animals have an endocannabinoid system also, they're able to benefit from cannabis as well. So a lot of times what we see patients using it for are things like chronic pain, especially with arthritis. We see them using it for anxiety, especially separation or noise anxiety, inflammatory conditions, nausea, appetite loss, seizures, and also cancer.
And with regard to what goes into the cannabis treatment for pets, what cannabinoids are you using?
So what we do is we use a full spectrum of cannabinoids. And what that refers to is that we take the crude or raw extracts from the plant because that has the largest amount of pharmacologically active compounds. There's over 400 different pharmacologically active compounds in cannabis. And when you're able to utilize crude or raw extracts, you're able to get the most out of that spectrum. And so we utilize, a cannabinoid that a lot of people have heard of called CBD, but there's also a lot of minor cannabinoids that we utilize, such as CBC and CBG, and we even utilize THC. A lot of people are under the false impression that THC can't be utilized in animals, but that's not the case. THC actually can be utilized in animals, but what we have to do is we have to make sure that we dose it and formulate it properly so that they're able to get the medical benefits of it without having any side effects.
And if you're administering THC to animals, sort of what's a safe amount? I would have thought that THC perhaps would be outside of pet care, but really interested to hear more.
Right. So THC has a number of medical benefits on its own. One is that it can be used for pain. It is an analgesic. And the other thing is that it can be very helpful for nausea and controlling nausea. It can also help to stimulate appetite. Some of our patients have a loss of appetite, either from conditions such as kidney failure or chronic GI conditions or cancer. THC also has anti-inflammatory properties. So there's a number of medical benefits that we're able to utilize from THC. But like I said before, dosing and formulation are going to be the most critical aspects of it. And so that's why it's so important that if we're going to utilize THC, that we have a formulation and a product that's been properly formulated by a veterinary professional, one that's familiar with the physiology of animals, because animals can be more sensitive than humans to certain cannabinoids like THC. For example, that we know that in dogs, their cerebellum, which is a part of the brain that controls motion and balance, it has a higher number of CB1 receptors compared to people and a lot of other species, meaning that they're more sensitive to THC. But that doesn't mean that they can't benefit from it. It just means that when we dose THC, we have to use it carefully, and it really helps to use it also in conjunction with other cannabinoids like CBD.
And on that, can THC be administered to all animals, or are there certain pets that respond better to THC than other types of animals?
So we've been using the same formulation since 2015, and that formulation's a 20-to-1 ratio. So what that means is for every 20 parts CBD, we have 1 part THC. And we've used it primarily in dogs and cats, but we've also used it in birds, rabbits, pigs, ferrets, rats, horses. So we've used it in a number of species and have been able to see the therapeutic benefits in multiple species.
Is the treatment focused around purely domestic pets, or can this be used for service animals, such as those used by armies, police, perhaps sniffer dogs?
It's possible, because there's a lot of therapeutic benefits, even if they're service animals. For example, we do work with a foundation that takes care of retired service canines. So a lot of these dogs are like German Shepherds that have been in the military or police forces, and they're retired now. Unfortunately, a lot of them actually suffer from things like PTSD or arthritis, and they have had a lot of benefits in using it for those conditions.
And for those who may challenge the efficacy of CBD pet care or cannabis-based pet care in itself, what would you say to them?
Well, we know that animals do have an endocannabinoid system, and they are able to benefit from cannabinoids very similar to how humans can. And while the clinical studies in the past haven't quite been there because of legislation and the rules around legalization, as we see legalization spread across the world, we are seeing more and more clinical trials coming out. So, for example, Cornell University had a study on CBD and dogs with arthritis benefiting. And then we saw another study coming out of Colorado State University about dogs and CBD and seizures. So we are seeing more and more clinical trials come online. Now, in the past few decades, ever since the 60s and the 70s, there's actually been a lot of preclinical trials establishing benefits of certain cannabinoids in lab animal models, for example, mice and rats. But as legalization spreads across the world, we are seeing more clinical trials come on in dogs and then also eventually in cats as well. And so we are seeing more and more of those trials establishing the benefits that we've seen in our patients for the past 4.5 years.
Forgive the potentially glib question, but how best are you able to document the tangible benefits and effects of CBD and other cannabis-based pet care, seeing as you're not sort of able to draw on patient advocate testimonies, as you would from humans?
Right. So what we do in animals is we look at the clinical signs. So perhaps the most obvious example is going to be seizures and epilepsy. We have a number of patients that are using it to help to control their seizures. And a lot of these pet owners have been recording the number of seizures that their pets have been having. So there's a number of cases where we've seen that the pets were actually having seizures on a daily basis. And sometimes this is even in conjunction with using traditional pharmaceuticals. And what the pet owners will notice is that as they incorporate CBD or cannabinoid therapeutics, is the number of seizures are not only decreasing, but if they do have any sort of breakthrough seizures, then the seizures are less intense than they were before. So observation of clinical signs is the biggest thing that we use in animals because they can't talk to us. They can't tell us how they're feeling. And so, for example, another situation is when we use it for things like pain and arthritis. So a lot of times what the owners will notice is that, the animal is not able to go for walks as long as they were before, or they're limping. And so what we'll do is we'll grade that limping. How severe is the limping? And so that way we're able to estimate how severe the pain is. For example, are they having more difficulty getting up in the mornings? And then what we'll do is talk to the owners, and once they've incorporated cannabis therapy, find out what clinical signs are there or are not there. So for example, if they were only able to go for a walk, for 2 blocks and then now they're able to go for a walk for 4 blocks. So that's the way that we're seeing improvement in these animals, is by the clinical signs or the lack of clinical signs.
So Tim, you're based in Los Angeles in California. Tell me about the regulatory landscape there for CBD products and cannabis-based products for pets, and perhaps across the United States.
Well, so what we're doing in California is actually pretty cool. We're really leading the way in regards to a lot of the cannabinoid therapeutics for animals. For example, last year there was an assembly bill called AB2215 that got signed into law. And what that law does is it allows for California veterinarians to discuss cannabis with their clients. So that was the first of its kind in the country, and as far as I know, the first of its kind in the world. Because previously veterinarians were not legally protected if they wanted to discuss cannabis with their clients. And so what that led to is, a lot of clients were really curious about how cannabis can benefit their pets. But because their veterinarians were unable to talk to them about it, they had to resort to advice from friends or family members, or things that they were finding on the internet. But what this law does is allows for the veterinarians to once again become that primary source of medical information for these clients. There's actually more legislation going on this year that would actually allow for California veterinarians to write medical recommendations for pet owners to be able to access medical cannabis products for their animals. So in a lot of regards, California is really leading the way for integration of cannabinoid therapeutics into veterinary medicine.
And with THC being one of the compounds that's in the VetCBD product, do you have any issues in distributing your line of products across state lines?
So for the VetCBD products, we only operate in California at this time. It is a cannabis product. So what that means is that it falls under the regulations of the California Bureau of Cannabis Control. And so every batch that we make has to be manufactured by a licensed manufacturer. It has to be transported by a licensed distributor. And what that also means is that for every single batch that we make, we have to test it to California cannabis standards, which is a great thing because that means that every single batch that's produced, we test it for potency to make sure that whatever's on the label actually matches what's in the bottle. And then we also test it for things like pesticides, solvents, mycotoxins, microbials, and heavy metals to make sure that we're getting clean, consistent, safe product.
And the product that you guys have out in the market, would it work without the THC there? Perhaps say a CBD-focused pet care product without THC, or does it really need that additional bump of THC in there?
So what we've seen in our own experience, and what a lot of physicians, veterinarians, and researchers have seen, is that when cannabinoid therapeutics are utilizing a full spectrum that contains small amounts of THC, there's actually a better therapeutic effect than if we were to use CBD on its own. And this is what's commonly referred to as the entourage effect, which describes the synergistic mechanisms of using multiple cannabinoids together to produce a greater therapeutic effect than if we were to use isolated individual cannabinoids. So that's why we've always used full spectrum products that contain small amounts of THC, because we get better therapeutic effect. And this is what we've seen over the years. And this is what's also documented in a lot of research papers, and also anecdotally amongst a lot of veterinarians and physicians who are familiar with cannabis products and utilizing them in their patients.
And so taking the regulatory landscape into account, what's the future for VetCBD's growth and expansion?
Well, we're looking to be able to have patients be able to access cannabinoid therapeutics across the world. We've seen such incredible benefits of cannabis for these animals. A lot of times we've seen situations where, for example, epilepsy cases where the seizures were uncontrolled and the owners were actually considering euthanasia because the quality of life was so poor that their animal was having severe seizures every single day that weren't able to be controlled. And once they incorporated cannabis, those seizures were able to be controlled, and that animal's quality of life was restored. The owner's quality of life is also restored too, because they don't have to see their animal suffering through these large-scale seizures every single day. And so there's really no reason why pet owners and pets around the world shouldn't be able to access these products and shouldn't be able to benefit from them, because at the end of the day, it's all about improving the quality of life of these animals. And so one of the biggest things that we do is we educate veterinarians, pet owners, and the cannabis industry on the benefits of cannabis for pets, but we also do a lot of advocacy. We also fight for access for pet owners to be able to access these products. And one of the things that we really want to be able to do is focus on a global expansion, because we want to be able to bring our expertise and the efficacy of our products to a global audience.
On the education piece, what channels and by what mediums do you use to educate sort of wider society? Of course, with the Facebook and Insta rules on advertising for CBD brands and really anything related to cannabis, there's a solid few channels there that are cut off. How do you guys go about things?
So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll talk to the veterinarians directly. For example, one of the things that I've done since the beginning of this year is I host a free webinar for veterinarians and veterinary hospitals that covers things like the background of cannabis, cannabinoids, and the clinical applications. I do a lot of other speaking as well to pet owners. I speak at veterinary conferences and I speak at cannabis conferences around the world. For example, I'll be at the Global Cannabis Institute in November talking about the cannabinoid therapeutics and their use in animals and in veterinary medicine.
So you touched upon something there as well, which I'd like to draw a little bit more on. What other cannabinoids can you see in the future being deployed for therapeutic treatment of animals?
So there's a lot of really interesting cannabinoids that are found in smaller quantities in cannabis and hemp plants. But as the technology gets better, what we've been able to see is that people are starting to isolate some of these cannabinoids so that we're able to use them directly and find out what benefits they can offer. So for example, something that's really interesting is CBG and also CBC. These have anti-pain properties, and they also have potentially anti-cancer properties. There's also other interesting cannabinoids like CBDV or THCV, and also the acid forms of these cannabinoids like CBDA and THCA. Now, these all have different properties on their own. So what we're looking to do is to be able to isolate these different cannabinoids, find out what specific properties that they have, and perhaps create custom blends or custom formulations for certain species and certain conditions.
And are there certain conditions that you're frequently getting asked upon by clients or peers of yours, whether cannabis medicines would be suitable or not for it?
Yeah, I think the greatest question that everybody has when it comes to cannabis is cancer. The interesting thing is that we have seen a lot of cancer cases where we've actually seen an improvement in quality of life, extension of life, and then in some cases, actual reduction in tumor sizes. Now, we haven't seen anything curative, but we have seen a lot of cases where cannabis has been shown to be therapeutic. The difficult aspect of cannabis and cancer is that there are so many different kinds of cancers out there. There's hundreds of different kinds of cancers. And when we're looking at cannabis, it's not just one formulation. For example, we could look at different ratios of CBD to THC, and certain ratios may be better suited for certain cancers. For example, maybe a 20 to 1 or a 10 to 1 may be better suited for this type of cancer. But then we also have to find out, could other cannabinoids be more potent for certain types of cancers? Could CBG be better for this cancer? Could CBDA be better for this type of cancer? And then at what dose? Is it better at, 0.5 milligram per kilogram, or is it better at 5 milligram per kilogram? And so when you multiply all these different combinations together, you get potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different permutations. And so that's one of the big questions in terms of cannabis research is how are we able to apply these different cannabinoids, the ratios that we're using and the doses to be able to apply to specific cancers. And that's what a lot of researchers are looking into. And that's something that we're also looking into as well.
I'm going to ask you to make a prediction now. So in a few years' time, I won't say exactly how many years, but say once a number of the key countries and economies in the world have liberalized even further their stance and their regulations and laws around cannabis, and access across state lines, country lines is a lot more free and open. With regard to veterinary care, how large a proportion do you think cannabis-based medicines will be a part of the wider veterinary treatment that's out there for pet care?
It's going to take up a significant portion. And the reason why is that we don't really see any other therapeutics that have such the spread that cannabis has. For example, when we're looking at traditional pharmaceuticals and we want to do something like we want to treat pain, well, we're not going to use that same product to do things like treat seizures or treat anxiety. But when we look at cannabis and what cannabis is able to do, we're able to utilize cannabis for things like pain, anxiety, nausea, seizures, inflammation, and cancer. And so the spread that it covers is very, very impressive. And quite frankly, it's not like anything else that we're accustomed to in terms of medicine. And the whole reason why is because of the endocannabinoid system. And this system was a system that is deeply intertwined in our physiology and the animal's physiology. And it was only discovered in the early 90s. So you can imagine something as complex as, say, the endocrine system only being discovered 30 years ago. And, now we're just learning about things like hormones. And we're just learning about, for example, if we were just learning about things like insulin or testosterone or estrogen and finding out what they do to our bodies. Well, that's kind of the state that we're at with cannabis, is that we just learned about the endocannabinoid system. We're learning more about it every single day. A lot of times what we thought was true 10 to 20 years ago doesn't always seem to be the case. And so really, this is a very, very early area of science and medicine. And the more that we find out about it, the more we realize just how wide of a spread it's able to encompass. And so that's why I think that cannabinoid therapeutics are going to play a huge role in not just veterinary medicine, but in medicine as a whole.
For professionally cannabis listeners who may be pet owners as well, if they were to administer a CBD product, perhaps CBD drops, to their dog or cat or whatever pet they have, what would the effect be? Would it be safe?
Well, first, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a product that's formulated by a veterinary professional, because we know that, for example, animals are not the same as humans, and certain ingredients are going to be not safe for animals. The biggest example is going to be chocolate. Humans can take chocolate just fine, but chocolate can be very, very dangerous to dogs. And there's a lot of other ingredients that are dangerous to animals that are perfectly suitable for people. For example, things like, grapes, raisins, macadamia nuts, or even xylitol is perfectly safe for humans. But those can actually be very, very dangerous and even life-threatening for animals. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that whatever product we're utilizing is formulated by professionals that have that background and understanding that animals' physiology and their bodies are unique and they're different from people. The other thing that we also want to make sure is that in terms of what's on the bottle is actually what's on the label. So testing is something that's very, very important. And what we do is we make sure that every single batch that we create is tested according to California cannabis standards, meaning that we test for potency to make sure that what's in the bottle, what's in the product actually matches what's on the label. And then what we also want to do is make sure that we're sourcing clean material. So that means testing for things like pesticides, solvents, heavy metals, microbials, and mycotoxins, because cannabis does come from a plant. It is an agricultural product. And so there is a risk of things like pesticides or contaminants that can get into agricultural products. So we want to make sure that we do rigorous lab testing on every single batch that's produced to make sure that we're giving our animals a safe product.
And I'm going to ask a very unprofessionally cannabis question here, and something that I'm not advocating. But if one of our listeners were to get their dog, cat, or other pet high, what would happen to their pet?
In terms of accidental ingestion, that does happen, because as legalization spreads, more and more people are having access to cannabis products. And if the cannabis products aren't always safely stowed away, then there is a chance that their animal could get into it. And whenever that happens, we always recommend that the client goes to see their veterinarian first and foremost, because you don't know what kind of ingredients could be safe or unsafe for that animal. You also don't know if they could have gotten into anything else besides the cannabis products. For example, could they have gotten into any sort of foreign objects that may get lodged in their intestinal tract? So the most important thing is that they see their veterinarian and have their veterinarian do a full workup and assessments, and that's going to be the best thing for them to do.
So Tim, we have time for one more question, and that's going to be, what would you say is the future for cannabis-based pet care? And what's the future for VetCBD?
Well, in terms of what we're looking at in the future is, the cannabis industry is a little bit different from, say, the hemp industry. There's different regulations and there's different guidelines, and with that comes different levels of accessibility. So while we do have our VetCBD line, that is our cannabis line, we also have a hemp line that's coming out. That one's called Dr. Shu's Pet Care, and that one is based on full spectrum hemp, which means that we do utilize CBD and a variety of other cannabinoids like CBC and CBG. And we have that line coming out for pet owners that may not have access to cannabis products, but have access to hemp-based products, because we do want to see animals around the world be able to benefit from this. And there's really no reason why patients and clients shouldn't have access to these products. So we want to make it as accessible as possible, so that way we can improve the quality of life for animals around the world.
And I imagine in the current regulatory climate, it will be that product that if you're pushing outside of California, be it through the States, Canada, or into Europe, that would be the one that you'd lead with?
Well, it's both. Basically what we see is we see cannabis, as the cannabis side of things, as what you might consider prescription strength. And then we see the hemp side of things as what you might consider over the counter.
Okay, great. Tim, you've been a fantastic guest. Thank you for joining us on Professionally Cannabis.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
Well, listeners, that was exciting, wasn't it? Makes me wish I was a dog to get my slobbery chops all over some of those treats. But I don't think that will be happening anytime soon. So that's it from us.
Parade of love.